UNICEF has released research on the devastating impact of the loss of education during lockdowns, while governments have designed remote learning with the potential to reach more than 1 billion students. At least a third of the world's school children have in fact been unable to access remote learning, according to this research. In other words, more than 450 million learners have been cut off from education. To discuss tonight, we're joined by UNICEF's Chief of Communication for Eastern and Southern Africa, James Elder. Mr. Elder, thank you for being with us. Take us through these findings that you've, after this research, done around the world.
Yeah, yet more staggering numbers from COVID. We know that there were lockdowns were essential. We see, as you had in your program then, some very good news that there's been declines. But we also saw the real push to get online learning for kids. Unfortunately, across the globe, particularly in Eastern and Southern Africa, many millions, as you said, more than 450 million kids simply don't have access. Yet again, this has been a pandemic, a crisis that has hit the most vulnerable. So rather than, again, keep that attention just in one place, it's so critical that we look to find ways to get kids into school because, yeah, as we say, 1 in 3 around the world, in this part of the world where you and I are, Eastern and Southern Africa, 1 in 2 kids are not getting any type of learning unless they're back in school.
So much more serious in this part of the world. And how serious is it that they've been left behind? It must have long-lasting consequences.
Yeah, I think it's cripplingly so. It's for UNICEF, it worries us as much as anything we've seen. We remember that governments and mums and dads have done so much this last 10 or 20 years. It's been a real education revolution to get the number of kids into schools that we see, 90% plus across most countries. That's changed. And what that means is that we have a risk now that this pandemic is with us for 10 years in terms of the impact on kids through education, not because of the virus. Girls are not going back to school. Girls, suddenly families think, okay, well, it's too expensive again, or they get dragged into child marriage. They do not go back. Teenage pregnancies are up. Violence is up. So these are things that will well outlive this virus. And that's why UNICEF is really pushing, working with governments, working with teachers unions, get kids back into school as safely as possible.
Looking at the South African situation, can you comment? Because it was very complex and government was wanting to send kids back to school earlier. The unions were concerned about infections. Then the World Health Organization piped up and said that kids should not go back to school while there's rising transmission in communities, which is all good and well, but has that sort of advice been geared at developed countries where there is online learning, maybe not considering our circumstances where there's abject poverty and a lack of connectivity?
It's a really good question. There's a couple of things there. Exactly. Lack of connectivity, lack of power in a lot of places, even to get things like television, and remembering so many of those kids who aren't in school if schools are closed are still in their communities. They're in their urban settings. They're in their rural settings. So you're not preventing the spread. What's also really important and really good news, we hear things like children might be silent spreaders, super spreaders. These things are not backed by evidence. In this part of the world, WHO says about 2.5% of all cases are school-age kids. That evidence is critical. That shows us that the risks of keeping kids out of school, for all those things we've spoken about tonight, they are greater than the actual risks of this pandemic. So it won't be an exercise in perfection. Please understand that. There will be outbreaks and so on. But when we take into account all the negative effects of children being out and potentially a lost generation, the evidence says, let's get these kids back.
But the World Health Organization didn't talk about our specific circumstances. And I know I'm pushing you here to comment on another agency, but I mean, are there learnings for UNICEF to be very careful about the advice given in situations like this, even though we've never been in such a situation?
Look, you're right. There's been so many areas of grey. Everyone has been learning as we've gone on this. Certainly, the World Health Organization has always put its best position forward, and there is advice that is regional and there is advice that is global. It's more than a month ago now that the Regional Director for UNICEF and the Regional Director for World Health Organization and the Regional Director for UNESCO, another education agency, all spoke about getting kids back into school, all the things that I'm talking with you about tonight. So they've been really clear on that. it is different contexts, and it's really important that we look at those different contexts about what schools look like in this part of the world, and again about why it's so important now, particularly as we see rates going down, that we can get kids back safely and that the risks of them being out do far outweigh those other considerations.
Finally, let me ask you, how important is TV-based instruction? And the SABC was actually involved in a launch yesterday, Warza Matrix, a catch-up for matrics in lockdown. Is that useful in the big scheme of things in terms of this catch-up needed right now?
Yeah, very, very useful. I mean, I've seen images of kids watching programs, learning through television, learning through SABC. SABC is a state broadcaster with enormous reach and a good background in some education work. So these numbers that we've seen today, seeing 1 in 2 kids in this part of the world don't access anything, that doesn't mean we stop trying. Things like SABC is doing, UNICEF's got a range of really innovative stuff. We put things on the internet, we put things on simple, non-web enabled phones that people can use for free. There's a lot of things that can be done, but what we're also saying is that let's not forget those 1 in 2 kids. Let's not talk about millions and millions. Let's remember the face of that boy and that girl who aren't in school and might be at high risk of bad nutrition or violence or pregnancy. Let's think about them and let's realise that they can't be reached right now. Let's do better at remote learning for all the reasons we know, but let's find a way with those kids to get them back in classrooms as the peaks are coming down safely.
Yeah, sure. Incredible research. So 1 in 2 children in Southern Africa left behind during lockdown. That was the UNICEF Chief of Communication for Eastern and Southern Africa, James Elder.